Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninjas here, and this follow-up for the last bootleg breakdown is a bit of a bootleg comparison to boot as well, because as it turns out I accidentally purchased one of the original Android 18 bootlegs, the ones that have been universally reviled for the most part. So since I happen to have it anyway in my possession, we might as well make a comparison between old and new to see exactly what the real differences are between the two. Just a general aside, I'm going to try to keep for this video the original bootleg on the left and the newer type on the right, just for clarity. Starting off on the boxes, as you can see from what I mentioned earlier, yeah, the last one, the one on the left, makes more of an effort to imitate the real one by having a lot of the original markers. So you have your Tamashii Nation order logo, your Bandai logo, information for the warning label is the same, but it also has the Tamashii Nation fake authentication sticker there. Well, that's entirely missing on the bootleg on the right, the newer one. They probably removed it for less copyright reasons, so they wouldn't get sued later. Another thing that got changed, the Dragon Ball logos themselves are a little different. On the old one, it isn't printed as nicely. There's a lot of black on the bottom there, while the new one is a bit of a cleaner print. Looking at the top of them, bootleg number 1 on the top there, and bootleg number 2 on the bottom there. There's definitely a difference between the print quality. I'd actually say the print quality on bootleg number 1, the original, generally speaking, tends to be nicer for the most part, except for one small detail. While the original one has definitely a higher quality print thing, what I would note is that the colors tend to be a little bit on the yellow side, a little more jaundiced on the original, while the newer one is a bit of a closer to the actual colors of the figure. Here's what the back of number 2 looks like, the newer one, and in a second we're going to pan over to the original. As you can see, the new one has a bit more of a dot measure pattern here. Well, the next one here, once it gets in focus, it's a cleaner pattern overall, but it's a definite yellow hue. No matter how you look at it, it is a different color. Another thing worth noting is the fonts on general and text on the first box are going to be a lot thinner, a lot more crisp, clean. But on the newer one, overall, it's a lot thicker here just because it's a lower quality print, like I said earlier. So it isn't as clean. It comes out a little blurry sometimes in cases. One thing I will note that the original bootleg has that the second one doesn't is, as far as I can tell, a perfect recreation of the operation manual, aka how to interchange the bits, that was provided with the first bootleg. If there's a difference between this and the original SH Figuarts version, I honestly can't tell at this point. It looks perfect. From there, we're going to move on to the actual attachments themselves here. We're going to start off with the Krillin bits in this case. Once again, bootleg 1 on the left, bootleg 2 on the right. In terms of their bootleg number 2, Krillin head is a little bit smaller, I find. Also, seems a bit smoothed out in certain parts, namely the forehead markings are a little more shallow on bootleg number 2. But generally speaking, the paint job seems to be fairly well. The decals, for the most part, are fine. So they're both quite serviceable. Oddly enough, different colors. We'll have to compare it with the real Krillin or another bootleg Krillin to see how well they match. For the hand bits, excuse me, they're both the wrong color compared to the Krillin heads they come with. In this case, they use the respective colors of the Android 18 cast, so they probably all got casted at the same time in the same plastic as Android 18, so they don't match. In terms of the detonators, they're about the same size. However, the casting shows there's a little bit of a difference there, namely on the actual metallic face parts. I find the first one has a bit more of a noticeable dimple of some sort there. There's circular marks kind of screws, while they're just kind of dots on the second one, so it's actually a little less detailed. For this part, the cross arms, I'm only going to show a bootleg number 1 because bootleg number 2, they're both basically the same casting. However, I noticed the jointing on the arms there are a little bit different, and in terms of the paint job, yeah, the skin tone used on the arms here does not match the bootleg it comes with. It's a very poorly painted piece. It doesn't reach all the way down the fingers there. It's the wrong color. There's not much more to say about that. In terms of the hands themselves, generally speaking, I find they're mostly the same. If anything, maybe the first hands were casted a little better. There's a little less flashing on them. However, what I will mention is the skin tone as a whole on the original Android 18 bootleg does suffer from having a weird reddish spray painted thing. I think they were trying to do some sort of shading on there, but just the color they used doesn't match. It doesn't make any sense. It's like they were trying to add a tan of some sort, but with a very badly fitted color. Maybe if it was a lighter pink or something like that, or some little beigeish, it might have fit in a little better, but here it doesn't work too well. And that kind of carries over to the heads. Suffice to say, the secondary bootlegs heads are done a lot better than the original bootlegs heads. What you're going to find here, as I'm having there, or as I'm kind of rotating around the bits there, the top of the heads, particularly where there should be paint because it meets with the hair, they're either unpainted or they're incredibly roughly painted and usually really rough casting, so it doesn't actually fit in proper with the heads that are supposed to go on there. The eyes are almost always offset on the original bootleg, and this one is no exception. They're much lower than they should be. Not to say that the second ones are perfect all the time. This one's an example of where they're both off, but even then, the original bootleg's way off. Like a good couple of millimeters off, in fact, from where it should be. And here's the last head I happen to have out. It's not the exact same head, I think, but still it shows the same general gist of things just not matching up right. Lastly, we look at the kind of cropped or the separate hair pieces. This one's for the wavy hair, I believe. Even in terms of the joint, that's just the original one on the left there is just much more roughly casted. The tabs look a lot thicker. They're not as cleanly cut. The detail in the hair I find was a lot looser, and there was a little more flashing in this case on bootleg number 1 than bootleg number 2, on top of having paint issues on top of other things. So kind of that puts the first part. Looking at the second part, you'll notice there are different size differences in terms of the pegs, just because of the way they were set up and casted. Also, I find the back part for number 2 there on the left, on the right there, is actually a smidge smaller in size, which I find a little curious. It has more detail. It's a better casting overall, but it is notably smaller in size. I'm not sure if that was an issue with the initial casting or if the second one was casted off, and this is their adjustment to it. Moving onward, we have the iron comparison that I wanted to make from the previous video here. In this case, the bootleg number 1 here, the original bootleg, has joints which better match with the original figure itself. They're more kind of cylindrical joints, and as you can definitely see, I don't need to even explain what's wrong with the wrist on the second arm that I'm carrying there. So if I say, yeah, the second or the original bootleg, the arms from that one match a lot better. They're closer to size with the original. They're in scale with the rest of the character. They have, generally speaking, the same kind of maneuverability. Maybe the wrist is a little tight in this case, but they're as they're supposed to be for the most part, so that's good to know at least. Admittedly, I'm kind of fast forwarding to this particular footage because a lot of the issues I have here tend to match up with what has appeared in other videos up to this point. So kind of to summarize, namely the joints, especially around the knees, I find because they've been poorly inserted in this case, they don't really fit like they're supposed to. They bend too far forward, and in one case, one of the knees I have doesn't bend far back enough in this case. Legs on the side there, they're somewhere between loose and tight. It's a bit of a weird spot on there. In terms of neck, the neck has kind of restricted movement, but that's because of the hair as well as the vest in there, so that's kind of uniform here. I find the joints on the original bootleg shoulders here, at least on mine, tend to be very tight on here. The elbows, not as tight, but they hold their poses fine, no problem. The wrists may be a little stiff there just because of the really tight fit. I'm a little more worried removing the joints or removing the hands trying to interchange them, feeling I might break something as the joints, while functional, are a little low quality if I'm being quite honest on there. Hip movement or waist movement is really limited, tends to pop off because it's very loose in this case. Here's me demonstrating the knees, by the way. And generally, in terms of leg movement, just to go back on that a bit, what I found is if it weren't for the skirt, this figure would actually have some really decent leg movement there. It's actually capable of doing a splits in this case, and if it weren't for the skirt restricted movement, it could probably get away with high kicks. In this case, the leg I'm trying to lift right now, or kind of adjust upward, is a little loose just because of the way the hip there is set up. Like I said, it's a little busted there, but it's not something that couldn't be fixed. I'd say, if anything, the original bootleg, maybe I just got lucky and this is a slightly better version of what has come out there, but I kind of wish that the skirt was a little more of a flimsier material or thinner material, more flexible, so it could get away with higher kicks and such, because this figure might have been viable on its own there. Maybe if things could have been flipped around a bit, maybe that would have been workable. But unfortunately, it needs work. And now for the big reveal of the video here. Here's what it looks like broken up on both sides. The literal breakdown shows both figures use very different joint systems. The first figure is, as far as I can tell, a much better match for what you expect out of a standard SH Figuarts figure, which means despite the poor casting job, which is why things are either too tight or loose around the hips there and waist, it's a close to a real deal. While the second one is going to be a much more simplified joint system, but things tend to fit a little better there. Unfortunately, what that means is that it's not as articulated. Like I said, you can't do the splits with the second figure as well. There's an entire hip waist joint that's missing because it's just cast as a big single piece there with the hips there. And unfortunately, both pieces or joints from both are not as interchangeable as I hope they might be. So what this means is, for whatever the next part of this video set comes up, I'm going to have to pick which one I want to start with and customize it out from there. Either that or see if I can't do something with them both, depending on if I can figure out how to mess around with some decals in order to redo the faces on head number 1 and clean that up from there. However, that's going to be another day. For now, I think I've gone as far as I can in terms of breaking down what the difference between different bootlegs that have come out for Android 18 are, and hopefully everyone who's watching this has learned something from this. Once again, just take a look at how they present the boxes and stuff to figure out which bootleg you're looking for when you decide to buy these, if you want to buy them. And that's it for now. Take care.